My husband tried to adopt another woman's child after discovering I was having an affair with a young colleague. I remember the day Victor told me he had a son. It came out of nowhere, over the creak of leather armchairs in our living room, after 30 years of marriage and silence about children. He told me the news in the same matter-of-fact tone he used to talk about his job as a financial investigator or his collection of old maps. But his eyes had a spark I hadn't seen in years. The strange part, of course, was that this child wasn't ours. And yet Victor wanted him, fiercely. You see, I wasn't the only one who had strayed. I wasn't the only one who had found something, or someone, to break up the endless hours of routine between breakfast, dinner, and bed. I thought I was the one leading a double life. Until I realized that Victor had one too. His relationship with that woman, Dahlia, had taken on a life of its own. And now he was bringing her son into our lives, making space in his heart for someone who had never belonged to us. I had to wonder, was this his revenge? Did he know about Owen, the young coworker who had found his way into my life, filling a gap I didn't even know existed? Or was it something worse than revenge, something Victor had chosen because, in the end, he'd simply found someone better than me? What makes it all stranger is that this child isn't even Victor's by blood. No, Thomas is the son of a woman Victor met during one of his cases. A woman who somehow managed to turn his head in a way I'd never seen before, making him behave as if he were still in his 20s, reckless and young. All I know is that Victor is determined to give this child a home. Our home. And he won't let me stop him. But I'm not one to sit quietly and let things unravel without understanding every thread. I may have my secrets, but I know Victor does too. And if he thinks he can hide anything from me, from the woman who has loved and loathed him in equal measure, he's gonna discover just how mistaken he is. For every lie he keeps hidden, I'll dig twice as deep. Because sometimes, love and hatred live closer than we think. And in this house, betrayal is the only currency that matters. Victor and I have been married for 30 years, a solid 30 years, that people in our town like to call goals. I hear it all the time at the museum where I work as a curator. You two are so lucky, they say. Lucky, as if luck is what it takes to build a life around a man who leaves only the smallest scraps of himself for you to keep. I suppose Victor was a good man. In the same way you might say that a plain meal is satisfying. He did his duty, paid his bills, and remembered our anniversary more often than he forgot it. He was as consistent as the chime of our grandfather clock, a clock he loved for reasons I never understood. It was the kind of stability most women crave. But I wasn't most women. A year ago, in a flash of longing and defiance, I began an affair with Owen. Owen, who's a good 30 years younger, joined our museum team as an exhibitions manager, energetic and full of ambition. I can't say it was his appearance, though he was handsome in that unpolished way young men sometimes are. No, it was his fascination with my work, his easy laughter, and the way he looked at me, not as a middle-aged woman, but as a person. The affair began slowly, a coffee here, a brush of his hand there. And before long, it blossomed into something undeniable. Months into my tryst with Owen, something about Victor changed. He became distant, but not in a way I could easily identify. His late nights at work became more frequent, his conversations more clipped. At first, I thought he'd finally sensed something amiss. Part of me even hoped he'd found out, that he would confront me and force me to choose. But Victor never worked that way. Confrontation was too direct, too human. No, whatever was distracting him had nothing to do with me. Or so I thought. One evening, as we sat down to our ritualistic silence over dinner, he cleared his throat. "B," he said, using the pet name that felt more like an artifact than an endearment by now. "I've been helping someone, a woman I met through work. She has a little boy." I remember laughing, a hollow sound that echoed in our dining room. "Helping? You mean like charity?" No, he said, looking at me with those eyes that never revealed more than they should. I'm taking care of them. Thomas, the boy, he's going to need a father. I felt the blood drain from my face. A father? Was he really saying what I thought he was? I looked at him, speechless. This was Victor, the man who barely expressed his emotions on the best of days, telling me, almost casually, that he intended to be a father to another woman's child. Not just a mentor or a support, but a father. And the way he said it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was like someone had swapped my husband with a stranger. What are you talking about? I managed, my voice sharper than I'd intended. He held my gaze, steady and unreadable. It's complicated, B. She's going through a lot. I've known her for months now. She's young, barely getting by, and Thomas doesn't have anyone else. Dahlia. The name lingered in the air, like a bitter taste. And what exactly are you to her, Victor? I asked, masking the hurt in my voice with a sarcastic edge. Are you her knight in shining armor? Or something more? Beatrice, he replied with a calm that infuriated me. I know this is difficult to understand, but I've grown close to them both. They're a part of my life now. His words sliced through the silence, and for the first time in years I felt true rage. The nerve of him. Here he was, sitting across from me, confessing to... What exactly? An affair? A new family? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but a part of me held back. Because in the back of my mind, the thought was already forming. Does he know about Owen? So I kept quiet, swallowing my questions, my hurt and my fury. I would get to the bottom of this, and if he thought he could upend my life so casually, then he had another thing coming. Over the next few weeks, Victor's behavior became even more peculiar. He started spending his weekends helping Dahlia with errands or fixing things around her apartment. It was as if he was living two lives, and I was merely a shadow in one of them. Meanwhile, I tried to carry on with my own double life, seeing Owen in secret, pretending nothing had changed. But now, every touch, every whispered word between us was tinged with doubt. Was I no better than Victor? Or was he somehow worse? One afternoon, after a particularly tense museum board meeting, I found myself in the gallery storage room with Owen. He reached out, his hand warm against my cheek, and for a moment I let myself forget. But then he looked at me, his eyes filled with a curiosity that seemed to pierce through my facade. Is everything okay? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. You seem distracted lately. I wanted to tell him, to confide everything about Victor and Dahlia, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain that my husband had a second family he was trying to build, all while I was living a lie of my own? Instead, I deflected, brushing it off with a laugh. It's just work. Nothing I can't handle. But I could tell he didn't believe me. And somehow, that only made the whole thing feel worse. My chance to meet Dahlia came sooner than I expected. One evening, Victor announced he was bringing her and Thomas over for dinner. They're like family to me now, he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Family? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor, we've been married for 30 years. We are supposed to be family. He didn't flinch. They're important to me, Bea. I'd like you to meet them. So I played along, smiling tightly as he set the table and fussed over details, things he'd never cared about before. The night arrived, and soon enough, Dahlia walked in, carrying Thomas in her arms, a small, dark-haired child with eyes that seemed far too wise for his age. Dahlia was younger than I'd expected, maybe in her late 20s, with a quiet, reserved air about her. She looked at me with a kind of polite caution, as though she were assessing her rival. I, in turn, scrutinized every inch of her, searching for what had captivated Victor so completely. Thomas, oblivious to the tension, squirmed in her arms, reaching for a spot on the table where Victor had placed a small wooden toy. The sight of him laughing as Victor made faces felt surreal. This child, this tiny stranger, had somehow worked his way into our lives without my permission. Over dinner, I tried to make small talk, asking Dahlia about her work and her life. She answered politely, but I could see there was more beneath the surface, something she was holding back. Victor, meanwhile, couldn't stop himself from doting on her, filling her plate, asking her if she needed anything else. It was as if he'd forgotten I was even there. At one point, when Victor stepped out of the room, Dahlia leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "I know this is hard for you, Beatrice, but Victor, he cares about Thomas, and I won't stand in the way of that." Her words felt like a knife. "Won't stand in the way?" I repeated, forcing a smile. "You're the one who brought him here." She looked down, her expression unreadable. "I didn't ask for this, you know. But Victor," he insisted. Something about the way she said it made me pause. Was Dahlia as much a victim in all this as I was? Or was she manipulating Victor, pulling him away from me with that carefully crafted vulnerability? Either way, one thing was clear. She was here to stay, and Victor would do anything to keep her and that child close. Over the following weeks, I began to gather what information I could about Dahlia. I learned that she worked at a small community center, doing administrative work. Her colleagues described her as sweet and dedicated, a young mother trying to make ends meet. But I knew there had to be more. No one just walks into a man's life and takes over like this without leaving a trace. In my search for answers, I found an unlikely ally in Lorraine, a woman from the museum's board who had connections everywhere in town. Lorraine was the type of woman who relished a good scandal, and when I confided in her about Victor's sudden adoption, she practically glowed with curiosity. "Dahlia, you say?" Lorraine leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "That name sounds familiar. I'm sure I've heard something about her." Over the next week, Lorraine worked her network, slipping into conversations and fishing for information. When she finally returned with news, it was both more and less than I'd hoped. "It turns out," Lorraine said one afternoon over tea, "our dear Dahlia was involved in some questionable business a few years back. Nothing too scandalous, mind you. But there were rumors about her working with a certain crowd, dealing with money exchanges that weren't exactly above board. She kept her nose clean, though, and nothing ever came of it." Her words hung in the air, a sinister possibility forming in my mind. What if Dahlia was using Victor, exploiting his need to feel young, to feel important, for some hidden agenda? And what if Thomas was part of that scheme? I thanked Lorraine, her words echoing in my mind as I returned home. Victor was away as usual, with Dahlia and Thomas, and I found myself pacing the empty house, thoughts swirling. I needed proof, something solid to expose Dahlia for whatever she was hiding. If she thought she could worm her way into my husband's life, she was mistaken. I'd fight fire with fire, and this time, I wouldn't be the one left in the dark. The day after my conversation with Lorraine, I woke up with renewed purpose. If there was one thing I knew how to do after years of watching Victor with his cases, it was how to investigate, quietly, without tipping anyone off. I was no stranger to secrets, after all. But this time, it wasn't my secrets I would be protecting. I started small. Victor kept a drawer in his study, usually locked, where he stored his case files. I knew that going through his personal things was risky, but if Dahlia was somehow tied up in a case of his, the answers might be there. One evening, after he left for a late meeting, I took my chance. I found the spare key he kept hidden in a book, and my heart raced as I unlocked the drawer. Inside were files stacked neatly, labeled with dates, and a few handwritten notes in Victor's careful script. I searched through the names, the places, and the dates, looking for anything connected to Dahlia. And finally, I found it, a slim file labeled Thomas Weston. I paused. Victor had created a file on Thomas? Inside was a sparse set of documents, birth records, some background checks, and financial statements. But one thing stood out. Dahlia had once lived in a city over 100 miles away, a fact she'd never mentioned. There were 2 police reports attached, each dated 5 years back, listing her as an associate of a man involved in fraud. The details were vague, but it was enough to stir my suspicions. What if Victor had come across Dahlia during his work, found her in a bind, and let sympathy, or attraction, get the best of him? And what if Dahlia had been looking for exactly that? Someone like Victor who could offer her a way out, financial stability, a steady hand. I barely heard the front door open. Victor's footsteps creaking on the stairs. I locked the drawer and slipped out of the study, my pulse racing. If Victor knew I'd seen that file, he'd never let me near his work again. But now I had what I needed. A connection. A reason to dig deeper. The next day I couldn't concentrate at work. The art gallery felt stifling, the air heavy with secrets. I texted Owen, asking him to meet me at a small cafe a few blocks away. I needed someone to talk to. Someone I could trust, if only a little. Owen arrived looking as concerned as he'd sounded in his texts. He had always been intuitive, and I realized now that he'd sensed the shift in me even before I'd fully understood it myself. "You look like you haven't slept," he said softly, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Everything's falling apart, Owen." I didn't plan to tell him everything, but he needed to understand why I'd been distant. Why our connection, however real it was, suddenly seemed like just another layer of the mess I'd created. He leaned in, his voice quiet and serious. "Yeah, I know you're going through something, but if you're in trouble, if you need help, I'm here." I took a deep breath, and before I could stop myself, I was telling him about Dahlia. I didn't mention Victor's file or what I'd found. I wasn't ready to share that yet. But I told him about Dahlia's presence in my life, Victor's sudden dedication to her and her son. I even hinted at my suspicions about Dahlia's intentions. Owen's face darkened. "So you think she's using him?" "I don't know what to think anymore," I admitted, "but something doesn't add up. And Victor, he's just going along with it, blind to everything." Owen frowned, and a strange look came over his face. There's something I need to tell you." My heart stopped. The way he looked down at his hands, the way he hesitated, it was as if he was preparing to tell something devastating. "I knew Dahlia," he finally said, his voice low. "A couple of years ago. It was nothing serious, but we crossed paths. I don't know if she remembers, but she has a history of latching on to men who can provide for her. She knows how to get what she wants." The room seemed to spin. Owen, the one person I thought I could count on, had known Dahlia all along? I felt a surge of anger and betrayal, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" He looked away, guilt etched across his face. "I didn't think it mattered, not until now." So Dahlia had a pattern. She'd done this before, sought out men who could protect her, offer her stability. And now she'd found the perfect target in Victor. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was far darker than I'd anticipated. Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to confront Dahlia directly. She was working at the community center that afternoon, and I knew she'd be alone for her shift. When I arrived, I found her in the back room, going through a stack of papers. She looked up, surprised, but composed herself quickly, giving me that placid, unreadable look I'd come to hate. "Beatrice," she said, her voice smooth and steady. "What a surprise." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what you're doing, Dahlia. I know your history, and I know you're manipulating Victor." Her expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, maybe annoyance, passed through her eyes. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do." I leaned closer, letting my voice drop. "You've done this before, haven't you? Latching on to men who can help you, who'll fall for the poor single mother routine." She tilted her head, a small, almost mocking smile playing on her lips. "So, Victor told you everything, did he?" "No," I replied sharply. "He didn't have to. I found out for myself." For a moment, she just stared at me, her gaze unwavering. Then she laughed, a quiet, unsettling sound. You're right, I've had my share of difficult times. But Victor? He came to me. He wanted to be a part of Thomas's life. Who am I to turn away help? The way she said it, as if Victor were just another pawn in her game, made my blood boil. You're playing with fire, Dahlia. If you think I'm going to let you walk away with everything I've built, you're mistaken. She leaned back, crossing her arms with a calm confidence that infuriated me. Oh, Beatrice, you really don't know Victor at all, do you? He's tired. Tired of this life you two have built, this prison you've kept him in. He told me he feels alive with us, with Thomas. I wanted to slap that smug look off her face, but instead I took a step back, letting her words sink in. Was it possible? Had Victor truly been so miserable, so desperate to escape that he'd seek out someone like Dahlia, someone with a child he could claim as his own? You'll regret this, I hissed, my voice trembling. You have no idea who you're dealing with. She simply shrugged, unbothered. We'll see about that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every word Dahlia had said echoed in my mind, chipping away at my confidence, feeding my doubts. Had I truly pushed Victor away? Was this all my fault, or was Dahlia manipulating him, twisting his feelings to suit her needs? There was only one way to find out. I would confront Victor directly, but not with accusations or anger. I would lay everything out in the open, force him to see what was at stake. And if he still chose Dahlia, then I would have nothing left to lose. That night, I lay awake, running my plan over and over in my mind. There would be no accusations, no anger. I would approach Victor with patience, openness. I would appeal to the side of him that had once cared deeply for me, if it was still there. I waited until Saturday, knowing he'd be home in the evening. The house was unusually quiet, the only sounds the creaks of the old beams and the distant hum of passing cars. I set up dinner as if it were just another night, arranging the plates with a calmness I didn't feel. I knew Dahlia wouldn't be expecting him that evening. She'd taken Thomas to visit her sister out of town. Tonight, it would just be the two of us. Victor arrived just as I finished lighting the candles. He looked tired, worn, and I noticed a slight hesitation in his step as he saw the table set for two. Is there an occasion? He asked, his tone wary. I smiled, pretending to be at ease. Just wanted to talk. It feels like we haven't had a real conversation in a long time. He gave a slight nod, looking around as if uncertain, but he sat down waiting for me to speak. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Victor, I know things have changed between us, and I know you found other people who mean a lot to you. He didn't respond right away, his gaze steady, his face carefully blank. It's not just that, Bea, it's the feeling of being alive again? I finished, watching his expression shift, caught off guard, his brows knitted together. How did you? I met Dahlia, I replied calmly. I've spoken to her. She made things very clear. She told me you're tired. Tired of us, of me. I struggled to keep my voice level. She said you feel alive with her. Victor's face softened, and for a moment, he looked almost like the man I'd fallen in love with years ago. Bea, it's not that simple. Then explain it to me, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Make me understand. He hesitated, running a hand over his face. Dahlia, she's different. She and Thomas, they remind me of things I'd forgotten. Life doesn't feel predictable with them. Predictable. The word stung, far more than I expected. And do you love her? I asked, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Victor looked away. His silence spoke louder than any answer. The reality settled like a weight in my chest. Victor was no longer fully mine. He hadn't been for a long time. But the shock quickly turned to determination. I couldn't let Dahlia simply walk away with everything I'd spent decades building. This house, this life, it was as much mine as it was his, and I wouldn't let her dismantle it, piece by piece. If she means so much to you, then why haven't you left? I demanded. Why string both of us along? Victor's jaw tightened. It's not that simple, Bea. You know how complicated things are. There's money, he He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. There's history. I gave a bitter laugh. History? That's what's keeping you here. He looked pained, but he didn't deny it, and that was enough to push me further. Victor, if you think you can build a life with her, go ahead, but I won't make it easy for you. My voice was steady, calm in a way I hadn't expected. I know things about her, things I'm sure you're not aware of. He narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? Oh, don't act so surprised, I said, crossing my arms. You didn't think I'd just stand by, did you? Dahlia has a past that could jeopardize everything if you're not careful. I could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a crack in his confidence. He knew I wouldn't bluff about something like this, and for the first time, I saw real fear in him. Fear that Dahlia might not be the innocent young woman he'd imagined. He didn't say anything that night, but I knew my words had unsettled him. In the days that followed, I watched as he grew distant, absorbed in thought. I could tell he was wondering, doubting, replaying my words and questioning every interaction he'd had with Dahlia. It was a small victory, but it felt like a lifeline. One evening, Victor left abruptly, saying he needed to clear his head. I waited until I was sure he was gone, then reached out to Lorraine. I asked her if she could look deeper into Dahlia's past, anything that might solidify my suspicions. Lorraine didn't disappoint. A few days later, she called me, her tone urgent. There's more, she said, her voice laced with excitement. Dahlia isn't just some innocent woman struggling to make ends meet. She was once involved in a scheme with an older man, a sort of sugar arrangement. He was wealthy and she was his companion for a few years. When he passed, there were rumors that she'd benefited quite a bit from his will. I listened, the pieces finally aligning. It all made sense now. Her ability to play the victim, to attract men who could offer stability, all the while hiding a past steeped in opportunism. With this new knowledge, I knew it was time to strike. Victor had to see Dahlia for who she truly was. I arranged another dinner, just the two of us, and prepared myself for the final confrontation. Victor looked wary when he arrived, and I wasted no time. I handed him a folder containing everything Lorraine had gathered, Dahlia's past relationships, the rumors surrounding her inheritance, even the police reports linking her to men who'd later found themselves mysteriously penniless. Look at this, I said, my voice cold. This is the woman you've been protecting, the woman you've risked our life for. Do you still think she's innocent? Victor's face drained of color as he flipped through the documents. His hands shook slightly, his eyes darting from one page to the next. I could see the realization dawning on him, the weight of it settling heavily. I didn't know, he murmured, almost to himself. I thought I was helping her. Helping her? I scoffed. Victor, you were being used. She saw your kindness, your generosity, and she exploited it, just like she's done to others. He looked up at me, a mixture of shame and anger in his eyes. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Would you have believed me? I replied, crossing my arms. You were so convinced that she was some kind of lost soul. I knew you wouldn't listen. He was silent, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. I could tell he was angry, perhaps even at me for exposing the truth, but there was a part of him that couldn't deny what he'd read. The days that followed were tense and silent. Victor withdrew even further, spending long hours at work or locked away in his study. I gave him his space, watching as he wrestled with the disillusionment I'd planted. It wasn't long before Dahlia started calling the house. Her voice desperate as she left message after message, pleading with Victor to talk to her, to explain why he'd suddenly disappeared. One evening after the third missed call, I picked up. Dahlia's voice was raw, pleading. Victor, please. I don't know what happened. If you're mad at me, just tell me why. I thought we were a family. I listened, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as her desperation grew. When she paused, I spoke calmly, letting the bitterness seep through. Dahlia, It's Beatrice." There was a moment of silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "Beatrice, what are you doing answering Victor's phone?" "I think the question is, what are you doing calling my husband?" I replied coldly. Her voice wavered. "Beatrice, please. I don't know what you told him, but I love him. I love him, and Thomas, he thinks of Victor as his father." I held back a bitter laugh. "Is that so? Or is it that you love what he can give you?" She didn't respond, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head, scrambling for an answer. I could tell I'd struck a nerve. "Stay away from him, Dahlia," I continued, "or I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done." She didn't answer, but the silence spoke volumes. I hung up, feeling a grim satisfaction settle over me. Victor eventually came to me, exhausted, his face lined with regret. He sat across from me in the living room, his shoulders slumped. "You were right, Bea," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was blind. I thought I was helping her, that I was doing something meaningful. But you were right." I wanted to feel triumphant, to bask in his admission. But instead, I felt hollow, as though I'd won a battle that didn't matter anymore. "Do you still love her?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. He looked away, a shadow of shame crossing his face. "I don't know what I feel anymore." We sat in silence, the weight of the years and betrayals between us, like a chasm that could never be bridged. In the end, Victor stayed, not out of love or even guilt, but out of a mutual understanding that we were bound together, trapped by our shared secrets and shattered trust. And Dahlia? She left town soon after, taking Thomas with her, disappearing as quickly as she'd arrived. I never heard from her again, and neither did Victor. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if she ever thinks of us. The life she almost stole, the family she nearly destroyed. Or maybe in the end, she was the one who truly saw us for what we were. A pair of lonely, desperate souls, clinging to the ruins of a life we'd long since lost. Dahlia's departure left an eerie silence in our lives. With her gone, the house felt cavernous, hollowed out. Even Victor, who'd once been so captivated by Dahlia's world, seemed adrift, as if the anchor he'd hoped to find in her had been yanked away. Our lives settled into a strange routine, a quiet partnership of sorts. But under the calm, a tension simmered, a mixture of bitterness, regret, and something close to resignation. We were bound by secrets, by a shared history, and by the wreckage we'd created together. Victor withdrew even further, becoming a ghost in his own home. He'd spend hours in his study, staring out the window, lost in thought. I could tell that the disillusionment was eating away at him, the realization that he'd been deceived, that he'd thrown away years of stability for an illusion. He had gambled on something he thought was new and meaningful, only to find it had been built on lies. One evening, as I passed by his study, I saw him sitting alone, his hands gripping the edges of his chair, his face lined with exhaustion. He looked up at me, and for the first time in months he spoke without pretense. "I'm sorry, Bea," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. "For everything. For being so blind, for hurting you like I did." I held his gaze, feeling a mixture of sympathy and anger. "You didn't just hurt me, Victor. You almost tore us apart. And for what? For a fantasy?" He nodded, his face etched with pain. "I don't know what I was thinking. I thought I could find something with her that I'd lost. Something I thought we'd lost." The honesty in his words stung. We had both searched for something outside our marriage, me and Owen, and him and Dahlia. But where I'd been discreet, Victor had almost sacrificed everything, blind to the consequences. "Maybe," I replied slowly, "we lost it because we stopped looking for it here." In the days that followed, Victor and I settled into a routine of shared silence, an unspoken truce that bound us together, if only by default. We both knew there was no going back to the way things were, yet neither of us was willing to leave. It was as if we'd made a silent pact to stay in this life we'd built, if only because starting anew felt like an impossible task. There was a strange comfort in the familiarity of each other's faults, a kind of resignation to the flaws we knew all too well. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I found myself breaking the silence. "So what now, Victor? We just go on like this? Pretend none of it happened?" He looked at me, a trace of sadness in his eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe we just accept it. Accept that this is where we've ended up." The thought settled heavily between us. Acceptance. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but a grudging acceptance of who we were and what we'd done. It wasn't what I'd imagined marriage to be all those years ago, but maybe it was all we had left. Weeks passed, and the days turned colder, the first hints of winter creeping in. One gray afternoon, as I was tidying up the house, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Victor was at work, so I answered cautiously, peering through the side window. To my shock, it was Owen. I opened the door, my heart pounding. He looked different. Older, somehow, as if the weight of our secrets had settled onto his shoulders as well. "B," he said, his voice tinged with a sadness I hadn't heard before. "I needed to see you, to talk." I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder as if Victor might appear any second, but I knew he wouldn't be home for hours. "Come in," I replied, stepping aside. Inside, Owen looked around the room, taking in the familiar surroundings. He had always been a part of a hidden world within these walls, a secret I'd kept from Victor and from myself. But now the walls seemed smaller, as if our secrets had finally caught up with us. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "I heard about Dahlia. She reached out to me a few weeks ago." My breath caught. "Dahlia? She's been in touch with you?" He nodded, looking down. "She asked for money. Said she was starting fresh, needed help. I didn't give it to her, though. I've learned my lesson." I felt a pang of sympathy for him, realizing that he, too, had been drawn into Dahlia's web, albeit in a different way. "What did you tell her?" "That I was done with her games, that I didn't want anything to do with her." He looked up, his gaze searching mine. "But Bia, I needed to see you, to tell you that I'm done with this too." The words hit me like a blow. I'd known, deep down, that this was inevitable. Our affair had been a fleeting escape, a temporary reprieve from the reality of our lives. But hearing him say it out loud made it feel final. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I understand." He reached out, his hand brushing mine. "I want you to know that whatever happens, I'll always care about you. But we both know this can't go on. It was never real, not in the way we wanted it to be." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, but I didn't stop it. In that moment, I knew he was right. What we'd shared had been real in its own way, but it was also a part of the lies we'd both been living. It was time to let go. We said our goodbyes, and as I watched him walk away, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. I was finally free, but the cost had been high. With Owen gone and Dahlia out of our lives, Victor and I found ourselves facing a blank slate of sorts. Our lives were stripped bare, left with nothing but each other and the wreckage we'd created. And for the first time, we had no secrets left to hide. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Victor broke the silence. "We could start over, he said, his voice tentative. "Try to rebuild something. It won't be perfect, but maybe it doesn't have to be." I looked at him, surprised. The idea of starting over seemed daunting, impossible even. But as I considered his words, a spark of possibility flickered in me. "Maybe," I replied slowly. "Maybe we can try." It wasn't a grand declaration of love or forgiveness. It was simply an acknowledgement that, after everything we'd been through, we still had a choice. We could choose to stay, to try again, even if the pieces didn't fit the way they once had. And so we began the slow, tentative process of rebuilding. We took it one day at a time, navigating the awkwardness, the resentment, and the lingering ghosts of our mistakes. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wondered if it was even worth it. But with each passing day, a fragile thread of trust began to grow between us. It was a faint glimmer, But it was enough. Months passed and the winter melted into spring. Our lives took on a new rhythm, quieter, more subdued, but somehow peaceful. There was a clarity that hadn't been there before, a kind of acceptance that came from facing our worst truths and surviving them. Victor and I would never return to the people we once were. The innocence of our early years was gone, replaced by scars and lessons learned the hard way. But in a strange way, I felt stronger, more grounded. We had been tested, our lives torn apart by lies and betrayals. But somehow, in the end, we'd found a way back to each other. Not out of obligation or habit, but out of a shared understanding. We'd seen each other's flaws, our deepest weaknesses, and chosen to stay anyway. There would always be shadows, memories of what we'd both done, lingering in the corners of our lives. But I had learned to live with them, to let them be a reminder of the choices we'd made and the consequences we'd faced. As I stood by the window one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't happiness, not in the traditional sense, but it was a kind of contentment, a quiet resilience that had come from weathering the storm and finding a way through. Victor joined me by the window, his hand slipping into mine. We stood there in silence, two people bound by history, by mistakes, and by a choice to stay. And as the last light faded, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. I know it was wrong, stupid, reckless, completely inappropriate. But that night, I didn't care. It was Ethan's birthday, his 23rd. The house was packed with his friends, half of them drunk and laughing too loudly, the other half sprawled out on the furniture like it was theirs. I wasn't planning to show up. I wasn't invited, not really. But something about the night, about Ethan, drew me in. I told myself I was just checking in, making sure the place wasn't destroyed by the time Raymond got back from his weekend fishing trip. But I didn't bother dressing the part. Instead, I threw on an oversized hoodie, the soft gray one that barely skimmed my thighs, and nothing else. By the time I arrived, the party was winding down. A few stragglers lingered in the kitchen, and someone was passed out on the living room floor. The smell of stale beer and cheap cologne hung in the air. I spotted Ethan leaning against the counter, a bottle of whiskey in one hand, his sleeves rolled up, to reveal the muscular arms I'd been trying not to notice for weeks. When he saw me, his eyes widened slightly. His gaze dropped, taking in the hoodie, the bare stretch of my legs beneath it. He didn't say a word, but the look on his face was enough to send a rush of heat through me. "You're here late," he said finally, his voice calm, but his eyes anything but. "I just wanted to check on things," I said, shrugging like it was no big deal. His lips quirked into a faint smirk, but he didn't push the conversation. The tension between us was thick, almost suffocating, but neither of us acknowledged it. As the last of his friends stumbled out the door, I stayed behind, grabbing an empty beer can off the counter to justify lingering. The house was quiet now, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching me with that same unreadable expression. "You don't have to stay," he said, but his voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I don't mind," I replied, my heart pounding. And I didn't. Because deep down, I already knew where the night was headed. The morning after the party, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot as it gurgled and hissed, filling the room with the comforting smell of fresh brew. My mind, however, was far from comforted. I kept replaying the way Ethan had looked at me when the last of his friends left, the heat in his gaze as he leaned closer to take the empty beer can from my hand. "You don't have to go," he had murmured, his voice low, his fingers brushing mine. I'd told myself I stayed behind to help clean up, but we both knew that wasn't true. Nothing had happened, yet. But the tension between us had been unbearable, and the way he'd looked at me made it clear, he felt it too. 6 months ago, Ethan had barely been a blip on my radar. He'd moved into the guest house after finishing college, claiming he needed space to figure things out. Raymond, my husband and his father, had barely batted an eye. Ethan wasn't a troublemaker, and he didn't ask for much. He worked part-time at a tech startup and spent the rest of his time either at the gym or hanging out with friends. At first, I didn't think much of him being around. I'd married Raymond 10 years ago, long after Ethan was grown, and our relationship had always been cordial but distant. I was the polite stepmom who remembered his birthday and offered him coffee when he visited, but nothing more. But something changed when he moved in. He wasn't the lanky kid I vaguely remembered meeting years ago. Ethan was confident now, broad-shouldered, with sharp features that caught my attention in ways I didn't want to admit. He had this quiet intensity about him, the kind of presence that filled a room without trying. I started noticing the little things. The way his voice dropped when he spoke to me, the way he leaned just a little too close when he passed me in the kitchen, the way his eyes lingered on me for a second too long. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining it. But then, the signs became harder to ignore. 2 weeks before his birthday party, there had been another moment. A smaller one, but no less significant. I was outside watering the garden, the late afternoon sun beating down on my shoulders. I wore a simple sundress, one that clung to my body in the heat. I didn't think twice about it. Raymond was at work and Ethan rarely left the guest house during the day. But when I turned toward the kitchen window, I saw him. He was standing there, watching me. His face was partially obscured by the glass, but I could see the way his eyes traced the curve of my body. He didn't look away when I caught him. He held my gaze, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I felt a flush creep up my neck, my heart pounding as I turned back to the garden. I tried to shake it off, but the look he gave me stayed with me long after I'd put the hose away. From that day on, things shifted between us. Ethan started leaving little notes for me, casual at first. A sticky note on the counter, "We're out of coffee." A slip of paper in my real estate files. "Nice dress today." The comments could have been innocent, but the way they made my stomach flip told me otherwise. I started noticing my own behavior changing too. I lingered in the kitchen longer when he was there, finding excuses to talk to him. I caught myself dressing differently, choosing fitted blouses and shorter skirts on days I knew he'd be home. I hated myself for it. I was a grown woman, married, with a successful career and a reputation to uphold. And yet Ethan had awakened something in me, something I thought had died years ago. Raymond, of course, didn't notice a thing. My husband had always been a practical man, more focused on his schedule and routines than on me. He wasn't unkind, but he was distant, preoccupied. He'd retired from the military a few years ago, and his days were spent tinkering in the garage or watching history documentaries. Our marriage was stable, predictable, and utterly passionless. It had been years since he'd touched me, in a way that felt meaningful, and I'd stopped trying to fix it long ago. Ethan was the opposite of everything Raymond represented. He was young, vibrant, and full of life. And every time he looked at me, I felt like I was waking up after years of sleepwalking. The week leading up to Ethan's birthday was a blur of anticipation and guilt. I told myself I wouldn't go to the party, that staying away was the best thing I could do. But the closer the day came, the more restless I felt. The night of the party, I stayed upstairs, listening to the sound of laughter and music drifting through the open windows. I told myself I was being responsible, giving Ethan his space. But as the hours dragged on, I found myself getting dressed, throwing on that oversized hoodie, and slipping out the back door before I could change my mind. Now, as I stood in the kitchen the next morning, the weight of what had almost happened settled over me like a storm cloud. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands trembling slightly, and took a deep breath. I needed to get a grip. Nothing had happened, yet, and if I was smart, nothing ever would. But as Ethan walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower and his shirt clinging to his chest, I felt my resolve falter. He gave me a small smile, his eyes meeting mine with that same intensity that had been haunting me for weeks. "Morning," he said, his voice low. "Morning," I replied, my pulse quickening. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, I caught him glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. The silence between us was thick, loaded with everything we weren't saying. I told myself to walk away, to leave the room before I did something I couldn't take back. But my feet stayed rooted to the floor, my heart pounding as he stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking with every second. This was just the beginning, and I knew it. The night of Ethan's birthday party had been a test of restraint, but the morning after was worse. Every time he moved, every time his eyes flicked to mine, I felt the unspoken tension buzzing between us, and I hated myself for doing the responsible thing, walking away, drawing a clear line. But I didn't. Later that afternoon, Raymond called to say he'd be staying another night at the fishing cabin. Normally, the news would have meant nothing to me, but this time, it felt like the universe was daring me to make the wrong choice. Ethan spent most of the day in the guest house, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I threw myself into housework, scrubbing the counters, reorganizing the pantry, anything to keep my mind from wandering to the way his lips had parted when he looked at me last night, or the way my body had responded just standing near him. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted but restless. The house felt too quiet, the air too heavy. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped out onto the back patio, hoping the cool breeze would settle my nerves. But then Ethan appeared. He came out of the guest house barefoot, wearing a simple t-shirt and sweats that hung low on his hips. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with his hands in his pockets, his gaze locked on mine. "Can't sleep?" he finally asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Something like that," I replied, taking a sip of wine to steady myself. He walked closer, each step deliberate, and sat down on the edge of the patio. "It's nice out," he said, looking up at the stars. I nodded, but I wasn't looking at the stars. I was looking at him. The silence between us stretched, comfortable at first, but quickly shifting into something heavier, more charged. I told myself to get up, to go inside and end this before it started. But when he turned to me, his eyes meeting mine, I knew it was already too late. "Last night," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind, "you looked different." I felt my cheeks flush, and I turned away, pretending to focus on the glass in my hand. "It was just a hoodie." "It wasn't just the hoodie," he said, his voice firm. My breath hitched, and I glanced at him, finding him closer than I expected. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was serious, his eyes searching mine for some kind of answer. "Ethan," I began, my voice trembling, but I didn't know how to finish. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. "You felt it too, didn't you?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The glass slipped from my hand, landing on the grass with a dull thud as I leaned into him, my hands gripping his shirt. His touch was cautious, almost reverent, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening. "Are you sure?" he whispered against my lips, his voice thick with hesitation. I wasn't sure. Not at all, but my body had already made the decision for me. "Yes," I breathed, barely recognizing my own voice. The hesitation vanished. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. My heart pounded in my chest, every rational thought drowned out by the sheer intensity of the moment. We didn't make it to the guest house. The patio furniture became our stage, the cool night air a stark contrast to the heat between us. His touch was firm but careful, his lips exploring every inch of my skin, as if he was trying to memorize me. For the first time in years, I felt desired. Truly desired. Not the way Raymond had touched me out of obligation or routine, but with a hunger that made me forget everything else. When it was over, we sat there in silence, the reality of what we'd done slowly sinking in. I pulled the hoodie tighter around me, my fingers trembling as I reached for the glass of wine still lying on the ground. "I don't regret it," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked at him, his face soft in the moonlight, and felt my chest tighten. "We can't do this again," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady. "Because it's wrong," I said, more to myself than to him. He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't going to let this be the end. The next few days were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. I avoided Ethan as much as I could, throwing myself into work and pretending nothing had happened. But it was impossible to ignore the way my heart raced every time I saw him, or the way his gaze lingered on me longer than it should. It didn't take long for him to break the silence. One evening, after Raymond had gone to bed, I found Ethan waiting for me in the kitchen. He was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Hey," he said, his voice casual but his eyes anything but. "Hey," I replied, my pulse quickening. "We need to talk," he said, his tone soft but firm. I hesitated, glancing toward the stairs to make sure Raymond was still asleep. "About what?" "About us," he said, stepping closer. "There is no us," I said quickly, though my voice lacked conviction. He raised an eyebrow, his smile growing. "Really?" "Because it didn't feel that way the other night." I felt my cheeks flush, and I turned away, busying myself with the dishes in the sink. But he didn't let me escape. He moved closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for a glass on the counter. "You don't have to pretend," he said softly, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. I closed my eyes, my hands gripping the edge of the sink. "This has to stop," I whispered. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because of him?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Ethan moved closer, his hand resting on my waist. "You deserve to be happy, Lorraine, and I think I make you happy." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. His expression was serious, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Before I could stop myself, I kissed him. That night, we found ourselves in his guest house, the small space filled with the soft glow of the bedside lamp. It was reckless, dangerous, but I didn't care. Ethan made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years, and I wasn't ready to let that go. There's a point in every bad decision where you realize there's no going back. For me, that moment came one night in Ethan's guest house, lying in his bed, his arm draped across my waist, like it had always belonged there. We didn't talk much after those nights. What could we say that didn't make it worse? Words like "this is wrong" or "this has to stop" felt pointless when my body kept betraying me, my heart racing every time he looked at me, like I was the only thing he wanted in the world. It didn't stop. If anything, it escalated. Our affair took on a rhythm, dangerous, intoxicating, and impossible to resist. We became experts at finding moments alone. Sometimes it was in the guest house, the blinds drawn tight, the sound of the TV masking the noise. Other times it was in my car, parked in an empty lot outside a supermarket or a quiet stretch of beach. Each time felt like the first, the thrill of secrecy coursing through my veins. The way Ethan touched me made me forget everything. Raymond, the house, the life I'd built. With him, I wasn't someone's wife or stepmother. I was just me. One of our most reckless moments happened in my office. I'd been working late, going through real estate contracts and staging schedules when Ethan called. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice low and teasing. "Yes," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I'm coming over." "Ethan?" But he'd already hung up. 20 minutes later, he walked through the door. He was wearing a leather jacket, his hair damp from the rain, and the look on his face made my breath catch. "Ethan, this is..." He didn't let me finish. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling me to my feet and kissing me before I could protest. "You've been working too hard," he murmured against my lips, his hands sliding to my hips. It was dangerous, stupid, but the second he touched me, every thought disappeared. We ended up tangled together on the couch in the back of my office, the sound of rain against the windows, the only witness to our indiscretion. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide. Raymond, oblivious as he was, started noticing little things. How I seemed distracted at dinner, how I was suddenly spending more time in the guest house under the guise of helping Ethan with paperwork. Then there was Marcy, my best friend. She'd always been sharp, able to read me better than anyone else, and lately she'd been giving me looks that made my stomach twist. One afternoon, we were having lunch at a small cafe downtown when she finally said something. "You seem different lately," she said, her tone casual but her eyes probing. "Different how?" I asked, trying to sound uninterested. She shrugged, stirring her coffee. "I don't know, distracted, like you're hiding something." I forced a laugh. "I think you're imagining things." "Am I?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before she let it drop, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Then there was Raymond. He wasn't an attentive man by any means, but he wasn't stupid. He started coming home earlier than usual, showing up unannounced during lunch breaks, and asking more questions than he ever had before. "Why were you in the guest house yesterday?" he asked one evening, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Ethan needed help with some paperwork for a new job, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Raymond didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me made my chest tighten. The close calls only made things worse. One night, after Raymond had gone to bed, I slipped out of the house and into the guest house. I didn't bother knocking. Ethan was waiting for me, his smile lazy and confident as he pulled me inside. "What if he wakes up?" I asked, even as Ethan's hands found my waist. "He won't," he said, his voice low and reassuring. But halfway through the night, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the guest house. My heart stopped as I scrambled to straighten my clothes, Ethan's expression shifting from calm to alarmed in an instant. The door rattled, but it didn't open. "Ethan?" Raymond's voice called from the other side. Ethan opened the door just wide enough to peek out. "What's up, Dad?" Raymond looked at him suspiciously, his eyes flicking to the rumpled couch behind him. "What are you doing out here so late?" "Couldn't sleep," Ethan said smoothly. "Thought I'd watch some TV." Raymond stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "Don't stay up too late." When he left, I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "That was too close," I whispered. Ethan smirked, pulling me back into his arms. "Close makes it exciting." But the excitement couldn't last forever. The cracks were starting to show. Marcy became more suspicious, her probing questions becoming harder to deflect. Raymond's behavior grew more erratic, his once blind trust giving way to sharp, pointed interrogations. And then there was Ethan. The closer we became, the more possessive he grew. He hated the time I spent with Raymond, even if it was just sitting in the same room. He started showing up unannounced at my office, texting me constantly, and demanding to know where I was when I wasn't with him. "You don't belong with him," he said one night, his voice low but firm. "You belong with me." "It's not that simple," I replied, my chest tightening. "Why not?" he demanded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What are you so afraid of?" "Everything," I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. The tension between us reached its peak one afternoon when Marcy showed up at the house unexpectedly. She caught me coming out of the guest house, my hair tousled and my cheeks flushed. "Lorraine," she said, her voice sharp. "What the hell are you doing?" I froze, my mind racing for an excuse. But the look on her face told me she already knew. "You can't keep doing this," she said, her voice low but urgent. "If Raymond finds out—" I didn't let her finish. "Marcy, please," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't say anything." Her eyes softened, but her jaw remained tight. "You need to end this, Lorraine, before it's too late." But deep down I knew it already was. The walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. It started with a text. I was at the office, flipping through property listings and trying to focus on work when my phone buzzed on the desk. It was from Ethan. "We need to talk, tonight." The message made my stomach twist. Ethan's texts were usually playful, teasing, but this one felt different, urgent, serious. I typed out a quick response. "What's wrong?" His reply came almost instantly. "Just come to the guest house after dinner. It's important." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Something was wrong. I could feel it. That evening, dinner with Raymond was unbearable. He barely spoke, pushing his food around his plate with a look I couldn't decipher. Normally, his silence would have been a relief, but tonight it felt heavy, suffocating. As soon as the dishes were cleared, I excused myself, claiming I had work to finish. Raymond didn't respond, just grunted and turned on the TV. I slipped out of the house and made my way to the guest house, the cool night air doing little to calm my nerves. When I opened the door, Ethan was pacing the small living room, his face tight with worry. "What's going on?" I asked, closing the door behind me. He stopped and looked at me, his jaw clenched. "It's Adam, Ethan's friend. The one who'd been giving me those knowing looks for weeks, like he was piecing something together." "What about him?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "He knows," Ethan said, his voice low. "He saw us texting, and he's threatening to tell Dad." The room seemed to tilt, and I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. "Why would he do that?" "He thinks he's helping," Ethan said bitterly. "He says this is messed up and that Dad deserves to know." My mind raced. If Adam told Raymond, it would be over. Everything. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stepped closer, his hands gripping my shoulders. "We end it before he can." We tell him ourselves. I stared at him, my heart hammering. Are you insane? That would destroy him. It's better than him finding out from Adam, Ethan argued. At least we can control the story. But there was no controlling this, no softening the blow. The decision was made for us the next day. I was at home cleaning up the kitchen when Raymond walked in holding an envelope. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders made my stomach churn. "What's this?" he asked, dropping the envelope on the counter in front of me. I froze, staring at it like it might explode. "I don't know," I said carefully. "Open it," he said, his voice dangerously calm. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope. Inside were photos, grainy but damning. Me and Ethan in the guest house, me leaving his room late at night, and the worst one, the two of us kissing in my office parking lot. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Do you have anything to say?" Raymond asked, his tone cold. "Raymond, I don't," he snapped, slamming his hand on the counter. "Don't you dare lie to me." Before I could respond, Ethan walked into the room. His eyes flicked to the envelope on the counter, and I saw the panic flash across his face. "Dad," he started, but Raymond cut him off. Just don't," Raymond said, his voice shaking with rage. "How long has this been going on?" Neither of us answered. "That's what I thought," Raymond said, his voice dripping with disgust. He turned to me, his face twisted with betrayal. "I trusted you, I married you, and this is what you do." "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "Sorry doesn't fix this," he spat. He turned to Ethan, his fists clenched. "And you're supposed to be my son, my own damn son." Ethan stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Dad, it's not what you think. You don't get to explain," Raymond shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Then, in one swift motion, he swung at Ethan. The fight was chaotic. Raymond's fist connected with Ethan's jaw, sending him stumbling back. But Ethan recovered quickly, shoving Raymond against the counter. "Stop it," I screamed, but neither of them listened. Raymond lunged again, his hand gripping Ethan's shirt as they grappled. The sound of furniture crashing filled the room, and for a moment I thought they might actually kill each other. Then it happened. Ethan shoved Raymond hard, and he lost his footing. He fell backward, his head striking the corner of the kitchen island with a sickening crack. Everything went still. "Dad?" Ethan's voice broke the silence, trembling with panic. I rushed to Raymond's side, my hands shaking as I pressed them against his head. Blood seeped through my fingers, and his breathing was shallow. "Call 911, I said, my voice shaking. Ethan fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it felt like an eternity. They loaded Raymond onto a stretcher, their expressions grim, and rushed him to the hospital. Ethan and I stood in the kitchen, the wreckage of the fight around us, neither of us saying a word. "This is my fault," Ethan said finally, his voice hollow. "No," I said, though the words felt meaningless. We both knew the truth. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and silence. Raymond survived the fall, but the damage was severe. The doctor said he had a concussion and a fractured skull, though he was lucky the injuries weren't worse. They kept him in the hospital for observation, but I didn't go to see him. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed home, pacing the house while the weight of everything we'd done pressed down on me like a suffocating fog. Raymond came home 3 days later. He was quiet, his face pale and his movements slow, but his eyes burned with cold fury. We didn't speak much, just short, clipped sentences about what needed to be done around the house. That night, after Ethan had gone to the guest house, Raymond finally confronted me. "You're leaving," he said, his voice steady but emotionless. I stared at him, my throat tightening. "Raymond, You don't get to explain," he snapped, his voice rising. "You've humiliated me, destroyed this family. You're lucky I haven't called the police." My breath hitched, and I looked away. "You have until the end of the week to pack your things," he said, his tone final. "And if you try to see Ethan again, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. Everyone." The words cut deeper than I expected, but I nodded. I didn't have a choice. The next morning, I started packing. Ethan came by the house while Raymond was out, his face pale and drawn. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice trembling. His expression shifted, panic flashing in his eyes. "What do you mean you're leaving?" "I don't have a choice," I said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "Raymond knows. He's giving me a way out, and I'm taking it. Ethan stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. You can't just leave. You don't have to do what he says. Yes, I do, I said, meeting his gaze. This is over, Ethan. It has to be. He knelt in front of me, his hands resting on my knees. We can leave together. Start over somewhere else. Just you and me. His words sent a pang through my chest, but I shook my head. That's not realistic, Ethan. You have your whole life ahead of you. I can't take that away from you. You're not taking anything from me, he said, his voice breaking. You're the only thing I want. Tears blurred my vision as I reached out, cupping his face in my hands. I love you, I whispered. But this isn't right. You know it isn't. He didn't say anything, just pulled me into his arms and held me like he was afraid to let go. By the end of the week, I was gone. I moved into a small apartment 2 towns over, a far cry from the house I'd called home for the past 10 years. It was quiet and lonely, but it was what I deserved. Ethan tried to call me a few times, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. I needed to let him go, for both our sakes. Months passed. The divorce was finalized quickly. Raymond wanted nothing to do with me, and I didn't fight him on anything. He kept the house, the cars, everything. I walked away with what little dignity I had left. One afternoon, as I was sitting by the window of my apartment, staring out at the gray, rainy street below, a letter arrived. It was from Ethan. The envelope was plain, with no return address, but I recognized his handwriting instantly. My hands trembled as I opened it. Lorraine, I'm sorry for everything. For hurting you, for ruining your life. I know you think I hate you for leaving, but I don't. I understand why you did it. I just wanted you to know that I'm okay. I'm starting over and I hope you are too. Maybe someday, when the dust has settled, we can talk. I'd like that. Until then, take care of yourself. I stared at the letter for a long time, the weight of his words settling over me like a blanket. Part of me wanted to write back, to tell him I missed him, to say I wanted to see him again. But another part of me knew it was better this way. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Maybe someday, I thought, but not today.